Hello. So I wanted to clarify something from the previous video where we were setting up Sequelize inside of Cloud9. Uh, this really has nothing to do with Cloud9. First of all, this could just be on your local machine and with the file directory set up the same way using npm through your console or terminal. Uh, I'm just using Cloud9 to have some consistency. That really has nothing to do with Sequelize. So there, that point, and then I wanted to make it clear that when we're dealing with Sequelize and databases in general, there's two parts to it. There's the first part, which is creating the database. So this is a one-time setup thing. You're creating the tables, you're defining what columns they have, making the association between the tables. You're setting everything up before your actual application is going to run. So that's the setup part. Then after that is all done, the next part is how you interact with a database while your application is running. This is where you're actually inserting things into the database and retrieving things from the database, and insert or update or delete. Um, this is how you modify data while the application is actually running. So that's the second part, and that's what I want to look at in this video. So from the last time, we used Sequelize to set up some files, and we created a user model. So we had first name, last name, and bio, just because that was the built-in example from the documentation. Whatever number of models you want to make, you just do the normal command line procedures to make them. But we'll stick with just user for now to keep it simple. So when we actually want to use the database and interact with it, we have to have a application running. Something has to be running to allow the user to interact with the database to insert or retrieve information. So I'm going to kind of finagle this. Instead of actually a realistic scenario, I'm going to just have a file called test Sequelize, and this is just going to be a fake starting entry point. So in real life, this might be the entry point to your Node app, or it might be the entry point to your web server if you're using Express, for example. But since we can just debug this, I can say, all right, when I select, and this is Cloud9 specific, when I select test Sequelize and I hit run, let me put a breakpoint so you can see that's running, and I say run, it will actually run this code directly from top to bottom just because this is the file I had selected. So that's an easy way to test or mimic you having an actual running application like a web server. So let me stop that so we can just look at what's actually in here. So if you look at this top part, this looks exactly the same as what was in index.js, because this is how we're setting up, well, let's see, I actually need this. This is how we're setting up the database, the database connection. So we have where the config file, where we have the username, password, database name, all that stuff. And then we're using this syntax to actually create a Sequelize object that we can interact with. So this is kind of boilerplate. Now, down here, what we have to do is create a user object to represent that we want to interact with the user table in MySQL. So from the previous setup, we've already created this table. It already exists. Now we need to interact with it. Well, you can, if you look at your user model, you can kind of see what is going on in here, and it looks very similar to what I have here. It's kind of the same thing. So you're kind of duplicating the code. You're having to do something over that you've already done. But this is just the way it has to be done, because this user model, code was used when you set up the database. And once you set it up, this code is just, it's ignored. You don't use it anymore. So when your application is actually running, now you need to recreate that code in order to use JavaScript to interact with MySQL. Otherwise, there'd be no way to do it through Sequelize. So we are just using Sequelize define, and we are saying we want to interact with the user table, and you have to redefine the attributes, which is kind of redundant, but it's required. This doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. You already know the user has all this stuff from over here, but you have to retell it that it needs those attributes here. So let me include the bio, and then you might notice that there's a different object in which these data types come off of: string, text. Before, they came off of this data types variable, but now they're just coming directly from the Sequelize that you imported. So it's kind of awkward, but that's just how it is. You have to redefine your object when you're actually running your application. So of course, this isn't really realistic. We've hard-coded user here just in this test file, just for demonstration purposes. And so we'll say, let's pretend we want to create something. So in order to actually create something, which means that you're going to insert something into the database, you use the create function off of the user object. So anytime you create something using Sequelize define, and then you put it into a variable, then that variable represents a user object that has a create method. This create function is what will directly talk to the database, and it will insert this information directly into MySQL. So if we kind of look here, I'm going to use the MySQL command line, and I'm going to say select all from users, which is the table that we created. You might notice that what Sequelize did was we created a table or a model called user, but it changed the table name to users. That's just something it does. I think there's a setting that allows you to avoid that, but I didn't set that setting, so that's just how it is for now. So I've already put some data in here, so you can see there's already a Jane Doe. So let's change that to John Doe. You see there's 2 records in here that I've inserted previously. So because we're in Cloud 9, we just have this file in Focus. I can just run it, and it will run that file that happened to be in Focus. Put a breakpoint so you can see kind of what's going on. Here's an object that you created. Its name is user. You can see the table name is users because of that thing where it automatically makes it plural. And then you can, well, there's a bunch of other stuff that's not important, but now it calls the create function, and we can just continue on because that's all that needs to happen. So if we stop this, So if we stop this, and we go back to the MySQL command line, and I execute the query, select all from users, sorry, I should not have push run with the breakpoint there. So I'm going to run it with no breakpoints just so it goes through the code and runs and executes. So you can see here it's console logging out the insert statement it did, and it put the last name, first name bio, and it put the actual values that we had in our code. And if we go back to MySQL and we select all from users, we can see the records are in there. I accidentally did it twice, so it's in there twice, but it is in there. So you can see that this is successfully inserting data into your users table. And so for whatever model you've created, it's the same process. So now that we've created data, what's the next natural progression is that we want to get that data. So we want to retrieve what's already in the table. So how do we do that? Okay, so when we want to retrieve data, what we're going to do is we still need to use this user object, the object in the user variable. This object needs to be used for all operations: inserting, updating, deleting, and retrieval. All need to use the same thing. So when you're trying to get things out of a database, there's two concepts: whether you're trying to get one specific thing or many things. So the Sequelize object has a built-in function for both of those. So if you know that whatever you're getting is there's only going to be one result, you might want to use the user find one function. So this in this scenario, you would say, okay, if we look at our database, in which case would we see in what scenario would there only be one record? Well, if we think about it, it's something in here uniquely identifies each record, and that is the ID. So if you try to find something by ID, say ID 2, which matches up with Jane Doe, you're always going to just find one record. So that would be a good case for find one. Now, when you use find one, you are going to assign a property called where, and this is the where you define what criteria you need to assign to your query. So you want to find one record, but what record? What record is it? And that's the syntax of the where clause. So it's just going to be, you're going to use an object literal, and then that object literal has a property called where, which is a object literal itself. And then you're going to say, what criteria do I want to apply to this? If, for example, we wanted the user where ID was 2, we just use the attribute ID and the value of 2. So this is going to tell Sequelize to go into the database, search for this ID, to pull it out and send it back into our JavaScript. But the trick here is that this is an asynchronous operation. So when you work with asynchronous operations, something like this is not going to work. It's not going to directly find something and immediately return it and put it into this variable. That just won't work. So we need to assign a callback. So we are going to use the then function, which is the reason we use then function is because find one returns a promise, and the promise, all promises just have this then function. What then indicates is that the asynchronous processing is done. And so the only way we can observe that is by providing a callback. And so this function right in here is our callback function. It's the thing that gets called back when the processing is done, when Sequelize is finished talking to the database and has our information. So let's see. The variable that you put into the callback, I just called Jane. You could call it whatever you want. It's going to represent the user object that we looked for. In this case, Jane Doe of ID 2. So in this case, we'll just console log it out so that we can see what we have. And we will simply run it, and we'll debug to see what happens. Okay, so the well, first of all, in the console, you can see the exact MySQL statement that was created, that was generated by your JavaScript code. It's this select ID, last name, blah, 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 from users as user, where ID equals 2. So you can kind of see that verbiage is describing exactly what we wanted to do. And so if we step over, we can see that we got our object Jane, and we have Jane Doe in here. So the kind of one of the ways that Sequelize works, this is just a Sequelize thing, is that you can't directly access the property. So, for instance, Jane Doe, we know Jane Doe has a first name because that's we defined that. We made that up ourselves. But the Sequelize specific object is going to put that onto the property of the object that gets returned. So here we can see that there is a first name property on this object because we defined it that it was on this object and it was retrieved from the database. So now you can use this object just like any other JavaScript object to do whatever you need to. Whether you want to return it back through your web server or whatever you want. So let's look at one other thing, and that is in a lot of cases. So if you look into our, if you look at our MySQL interface, you can see what kind of things in here are duplicated. So you can see, oh, everybody has the last name Doe, D-O-E. So that's a duplicate thing. Like many records have this attribute. So if you, in whatever scenario you wanted to retrieve multiple things, you would use another function. So instead of find one, you would want to use the find all. This is going to give you the ability to retrieve many things. Now, if we used ID, that would kind of defeat the purpose because there's only ever going to be one record with ID 2, so that's kind of pointless. So let's change this where clause to name. Oops, it's not just name, it's last name Doe. So that will result in many people being retrieved from the database, not just one thing. And let's run that so we can see this working. Everything else will be the same. You still have to use then, you still have to use a callback. And you can see the this SQL statement right here, which was generated. It says select all the regular stuff from users where last name equals Doe. So we know that that's going to return multiple things. So if we continue on, okay, if you look at people, well, you see that people is now, instead of one object, it's an array because multiple things were returned. How do you do that in JavaScript? You put multiple things into an array. So this is no longer one single object, so we need to now operate on it as if it was an array, which it is. So I'm going to use the index of 0 just to get the first person, just for testing purposes. Okay. And we can see that if we hover over first name and we see in the console, it output Jane. So we are successfully retrieving the information from the database. So we have the ability to find one thing or to find many things. And you can use the where clause to mix and match different criteria to your heart's desire. Whatever attributes there are, you can search on them. You can search on first name, last name, bio, ID, and anything else. If you made up your own model, whatever it had, car, number of doors, engine size, pet, hair color, anything. So you can kind of see how the pattern of how you do this, and it's applicable to any scenario, not just the user that we happen to define here as an example. So I hope that helped. Next time, I think I'll show you how to implement this in Express so that you can actually make use of this. So right now we're just using a test file, which is completely useless except for testing, because it doesn't make this information available to the outside world for anyone to use. It's not useful. So what you'd want to do is make your own API so that the outside world can create this data and retrieve the data and make it an actual useful thing. So we'll look at that next.